I'm going to attempt to explain the mind and how everything is mind, and I'm going to attempt to prove this in a logical sense. I can't prove this physically because it's not measurable, but I want to demonstrate logically as a abstract model why I believe everything is mind. So let's start with the definition of mind, or my definition of mind. And it's important that we kind of establish this definition because I do not define mind the way that society generally defines it. I am not defining mind as human consciousness or animal consciousness. Okay, so let's get that out of the way right now. When I say mind, I am referring to something far more fundamental, something that is not limited to a brain. Okay, it's not thought necessarily, it's something very unique. And so the definition I'm providing here is mind is the self-observing source and medium of information and form. Okay, so I'll explain more about what that means in a moment, but we just talked in the last video about the concept of the observer, right? We talked about how the observer basically breaks down into the flow of information inside of and outside of a type of barrier or membrane. Okay, so we're going to use this circle to represent the membrane, and the membrane is just any kind of barrier, right? Any kind of barrier that separates two things. So if we think about our skin as a barrier, right? A soap bubble has a barrier. Anything that has separation between two things means that information can be transferred between those two things. So at the beginning of the universe, right, we talked previously about the concept of information becomes known, right? It becomes known, or it becomes certain the closer it is to what we think of as the conceptual center of the observer, right? The center of the observer meaning it is closer to that 100% certain point. So the more we know about something, the more it is observed, and the more it becomes a part of the observer, and that's why I'm referring to it as the center of the observer, because the more it is a part of the observer, the closer it is to the center of the observer. And so at the edge, we're talking about interactions, right? We're talking about interactions between the outside world and forms on the outside world and the inside world, where those forms become information. They become modeled information, right? And again, I'm not talking about just in a human mind. I'm also talking about in objects and unconscious things that don't possess a brain. So for example, when one pool ball hits another pool ball, right? The way that it hits it, the energy that's transferred into it, the momentum exchange and all these other things, that counts as information that's being transferred. So because of the way the interaction, the collision between the two pool balls, because of the way it changes, right? Because of the way that this pool ball that's been struck changes its state, its form, it now contains new information. So the new information that it contains is its new self, okay? Its new self. Okay, so that concept of a self is this. This is what we're talking about. The observer is the separation between self and non-self. All right, that's what this barrier is. And again, I understand this is very complicated, very abstract, and so it's difficult to comprehend for a lot of people talking about concepts like self, but then saying it doesn't have to be a conscious human being or an animal. Normally we'd think of only animals as containing self, but that's not what I'm teaching you as a model. What I'm teaching you is that any object contains a self based on the state of that object, okay? So it doesn't have to be observing itself, right? This is where the mind becomes important. But every object that has information within itself, that is the state of that object, that is the form of that object, okay? And that becomes itself. So whether or not it observes the self, it still has a self. So a pool ball, right, the way it behaves is based on the nature of itself, and itself is the information it contains, right? When we think about like what is the mass of the pool ball, right? What is the momentum of the pool ball? Or what's the color of the pool ball? What's the shape of the pool ball? All of these things are contained within the pool ball, right? That is the self of the pool ball, is the information that is contained there. The pool ball does not have to be self-aware of this information in order to contain it, right? But it does, in order for anything to access this, it does have to interact with the pool ball, right? That's why we talked previously about the idea of without interaction, everything exists in that state of uncertainty because the information has not yet been transferred inside of the observer. It has not been transferred through the process of observation, right? So once the two objects interact, then that information from the external object becomes more certain based on the information that has been transferred. And depending on whether or not the observer can observe itself, it has access to that information to model it, to simulate it as a simulation of the outside world, okay? So it's getting a bit complicated, but let me try to break it down here in terms of why this is important and why it proves, logically proves, not scientifically, why it logically proves to me the idea that everything is mind and that the universe wouldn't exist if it wasn't mind, okay? So this self-observing part is extremely important. So I want you to think about the beginning of the universe. I know this is difficult to conceptualize, to imagine, but think of the beginning of the universe. In the beginning, getting very biblical here, there was nothing, or nothingness, right? So what do I mean by this? I mean that in the beginning, there's no interaction, right? No measurement has been taken. So because no measurement has been taken, there's been no interaction between the internal and the external. No observers have been given information at this point. So there's only nothingness. All right. So to think of it like in a more simple way, no pool balls have collided because there are no pool balls yet. In order for a pool ball to exist, it has to exist in one of two states. Either has to exist internally or externally. What I mean by externally is that if there are two pool balls, right? Sorry for the awful circle. When one pool ball collides with another, then this pool ball exists external to this pool ball because it has interacted with it. And so in that transfer information, this pool ball, we'll call it pool ball A, is telling pool ball B that it exists through the transfer of information, through interaction, right? So interaction. But if there's no interaction, then nothing exists externally, right? So it kind of comes back to that metaphor of the house, right? If you're inside of a house and you get no information from outside, then what exists outside? Nothingness. That's it. You can't interpret anything from the outside because there's no flow of information from the outside to the inside, right? So all that exists outside is this uncertainty. And what is the state of uncertainty? Nothingness. It's formless, right? So when we think of or conceptualize absolute uncertainty, when there's zero information available, it's formless. It's nothingness. So how do we get from a state of absolute nothingness where there's no interaction between anything in the universe, no interaction, and yet somehow we begin interacting? How do these forms condense from nothingness, right? How do we get from here to here? How do we get from formless to form? And the answer to that is mind, right? And the key to the difference between an observer and a mind is self-observation. If we do not have the ability for self-observation, then the formless never condenses, it never collapses into form because there is never an interaction. Why is there no interaction? Because prior to forms, there are no forms to interact, right? It's a very simple concept. If you have no pool balls, then no pool balls can collide, right? And the only way you get pool balls is if there's form, and the only way you get form is through interaction, right? So we get a conundrum, we get a paradox where it's like, if you have no form, how do you get form if the way to get form is through forms interacting? And that is where this concept of self-observation becomes so key. So the way that we get forms is through the self-interaction of the observer and the state of nothingness. So what I mean by that is when we have a state of nothingness, nothingness itself is a state, right? It's a state of uncertainty. And so if we don't have a mind, an observer that is capable of observing the state of uncertainty, then no future will exist. No next step in the process, right? So if we think of it like a chain, right, we have uncertainty here and absolute nothingness. Oops, nothingness and formlessness. So this is the beginning state, right? So this is the beginning. Then we have, from the beginning, there's two possible outcomes, right? If we have a mind, which again we're talking about is a self-observing observer, right? If we have a self-observing observer, then we can interpret nothingness as a state or form. So I want you to use this as a mental exercise, right? And again, you're using a complex human brain and a complex human mind, but at the simplest level, any observer that is capable of self-observing is able to do this, okay? And I'm saying that the mind is the only observer, the only category or type of observer that is capable of observing itself, but the mind is fundamental. It doesn't have to be complex. It can be simple. It can be fundamental. It doesn't have to be a brain. It doesn't have to be a living organism. It can be as simple as just a self-observing observer. So all other observers come from the self-observing observer. And we'll get into that in a second. So in order to interpret the state of nothingness, the example I want to use is if you're in that house, right? If you as a complex human are in that house with no door, no windows, and you can't see outside, you can still conceptualize the nothingness outside, right? You won't know what it is. You can't define it, right? You can't say what it is because it's nothing. It's nothing in specific. It is uncertainty, which means that it is everything and nothing at the same time. It could be anything, but because it could be anything, it's also nothing in particular. Right? So if I say that it's a number between 1 and 10, I'm not saying it's 5, right? I'm saying that it could be any number between 1 and 10. And because it is any number between 1 and 10, it could be any of those numbers and is therefore not a specific number yet until we observe it, right? Until we interact with it. So basically, what this concept means in terms of conceptualizing a nothingness, if you do not have a self-observing observer. So in this example over here, if we do not have a self-observing observer, then what we end up with is still nothingness. Right? And we never get to anything else. It repeats this process of nothing. It never ever becomes form. We can't form anything from no mind. Until an observation occurs, no information can be condensed or generated into form. And the only information we have at the beginning of the universe is no information, right? We have absolute uncertainty, nothingness, and formlessness. So if there is nothing to observe uncertainty, nothingness, and formlessness, if nothing can interact with it, then it doesn't become a form. It just remains nothingness for all of eternity. But we know from looking around us, I'm talking to you through a computer right now, that's an object, I'm an object, you're an object, everything you're touching and holding is an object. We know that information condenses into definition, right? It goes from uncertain to certain, which means that an observation occurred, right? We translated or transmuted information from a state of nothingness, from a state of uncertainty. Remember, go back to the states of water, right? The state of absolute uncertainty, the void, we translated or reconfigured the void into something, into states with higher levels of certainty, into forms like objects and people. So the only way that can possibly happen is if you have a mind. So hopefully that explains the basic concept of how, if we understand the concept of an observer and we understand the concept of information being something that is exchanged between observers, right? Information doesn't exist outside of an observer. It's the observer's conceptualization that becomes the information. And so if we have a bigger observer, which we'll get into this more later, if we have a bigger observer and that observer can conceptualize nothingness, then nothingness becomes information within itself. So if we have nothing, right, nothing is outside the observer. So it's just the observer. There's nothing in the universe except for this observer. That nothingness, if conceptualized by the observer, and again, it's not that there's something actually physically outside the observer. It's not that there's a physical nothingness outside the observer. What I'm saying is that because there's only the observer and there's nothing except for the observer, all that exists for the observer to conceptualize is nothingness. But when the observer conceptualizes nothingness, it interacts with it. So the observer is all that exists, but because it is able to conceptualize nothingness outside of itself, it also conceptualizes nothing within itself. And so nothingness becomes an object. Just like your imagination, when you imagine the concept of that nothingness outside the house, it's not a form yet. It's not a physical object per se. It's a conceptual object, right? It's an information object. But your mind can still render it to a degree. Because just as you can picture that there's nothing outside the house, right? You can't touch the nothing, you can't, quantify it exactly, but you can say there's nothing outside the house, and you can understand what that means. And so that conceptualization of nothingness becomes an object. And once we have an object within the observer, we can create more objects, right? We can create more concepts of things within the observer that can now interact with each other and can then become observers themselves, right? So each of these objects, because they are contained within a self-observing mind, are permeated by that self-observing mind. So each of the objects within the observer become themselves observers. Now again, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are conscious observers. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are self-aware animals, right? These are different concepts of mind, different levels and layers of mind. But at the simplest, most fundamental level, we have the one original observer, which you can call God, or you can call, the all, the source, whatever you want to call it. But if we don't have this observer, then we never get anything. Nothing becomes conceptualized. No information exists. No information is generated. So we remain in a state of nothingness forever. And rather than repeat that point over and over again, I hope that the demonstration I've given has been adequate to at least give you the impression that, okay, maybe I don't fully agree with this yet. Maybe I don't fully understand it yet. But at least I understand what he's trying to say. At least I understand the logic behind it and the model that he's building. And we'll continue to build on this model. And I hope that as we continue to build on it and you start to see more pieces put together as a puzzle, that the bigger puzzle picture will make more sense to you.